Tell me this. If a presidential candidate receives a majority of the popular vote and loses the election, how does that make sense? The Electoral College made perfect sense when the Constitution was written. The population of the United States was exponentially smaller, and there was a more even distribution of people between the states. But now, frankly, the country is too big for the Electoral College to work. Our political candidates are supposed to be elected based off of what the people want, not states. The Electoral College is not an accurate representation of what the United States actually wants, and the only way to fix that is to disband the Electoral College and elect our officials based solely on popular vote. I will be using recent examples of how the Electoral College has failed to appease what the most people want, as well as the practical reasoning behind abolishing the Electoral College in order to convince you that getting rid of the Electoral College is the right choice. There are a few recent examples of the Electoral College failing to uphold its ultimate purpose, which is to elect the person the people want. According to the presidential election results of the last 30 years, we have had 8 different presidential elections. In that time, we've had 5 different presidents. Out of those 8 elections, the presidential candidate who received less of the popular vote was elected 4 times. In 1992, Bill Clinton received just 43.01% of the popular vote and won. He was re-elected in 1996 while receiving 49.23% of the popular vote. In 2000, George W. Bush became the second Bush to sit in the Oval Office after receiving 47.87% of the popular vote. Most recently, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected after receiving 46.09% of the popular vote. Now let me ask, doesn't that seem counterintuitive? If a candidate being elected receives less of the popular vote than their opponent, shouldn't that mean that they lose the election? To me, it does. You may look at the percentages and think there isn't much of a difference between 49.23% and 50%. You're right. There isn't much of a difference between those two numbers themselves. But if you think about what those numbers represent, they represent people. And even a 1% difference in that percentage represents 3.3 million people. Comparing that to when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, that would mean he was about 12 million votes off from just breaking even in the popular vote. That's an additional 12 million people who didn't want to see him in office. That's 12 million people who are most likely not going to benefit from his policies and time as president. It seems like a much bigger issue now, doesn't it? My second point on why the Electoral College should be abolished is relatively simple. It's impractical for the country we live in nowadays. If it hadn't already existed, no one today would think of creating it. The winner-take-all approach that 48 of our states employ when counting popular votes is used to maximize their influence over the results of the election. It doesn't actually take into account what the voting population of the country wants. The number of electoral votes in a state doesn't actually count the number of people voting in that state. It counts the number of people that live in that state. The Electoral College assumes that the size of any given state affects our political preferences, even though that is absolutely not true. Replacing the Electoral College with a national popular vote would ensure that every single person's vote is worth exactly the same. Having a national popular vote would provide more of an incentive for people in states that are largely Democrat or Republican to actually go out and vote, creating more individual engagement in the process. Finally, a national popular election might be able to provide a solution for the delegitimizing of the president-elect that has plagued the country for the past 2 decades. There would be no more room to argue over red or blue states, as the only thing that would matter is who wins the election. It may not solve the problem completely, but it may very well work to mitigate it. In summary, the Electoral College does more bad than good when being applied to presidential elections. It doesn't accurately reflect what the voting population wants, and does more to make smaller states feel included than it does to make sure that the winner of the election is who the people actually want. The solution I'm proposing is much simpler than the Electoral College. A national popular vote will ensure that every single person's vote matters as much as anyone else's, and it will also ensure that whomever is elected as a person that the majority of the country wants in office. Like I previously stated, the Electoral College is not an accurate representation of what the United States actually wants, and the only way to fix that is to disband the Electoral College and elect our officials based solely on popular vote. I hope that I provided enough evidence and a good enough argument for you to consider my solution to be the right thing to do. Thank you.